Welcome to the Living for His Glory podcast. I'm your host, Lucas Barrett. As a college student studying pastoral ministry, spreading the word and making disciples of all nations is my one true mission. Sometimes I talk about scriptures and theologies on my own, but other times I bring in a guest from my vast network of people who will share their life experiences and the things that they're passionate about that may help you with your own spiritual journey. Whether you're a new Christian, a growing Christian, or someone who may not even believe in God, this podcast is for you. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. We're back with another exciting episode of the Living for His Glory podcast, and today we're coming from Genesis 35. Now, it's important to provide context for this story. Today, we are going to witness this story of Jacob and his beloved wife, Rachel. He has two wives, Leah and Rachel. They're sisters. Plot twist for those who don't know. They are sisters, and their dad married them to Jacob. Now, Jacob's intention was always to marry Rachel and not Leah, but on the wedding night, I guess Jacob had a little bit too much to drink, didn't realize that dear old dad-in-law switched up Leah and Rachel. Jacob married Leah, and eventually he did marry Rachel, but now he's got these two wives, and Rachel's the one he truly loves. Leah's the one that had most of his kids. But here we see the death of Rachel. Here, his beloved wife is dying. We're starting off in Genesis 35. It says, "So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath," that is Bethlehem. "And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb that is there to this day. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder." Now, there's so much just powerful stuff in that. And I love the way that the Old Testament writes. I love how the way that the Old Testament is written. There's so much powerful language used here. There's so much interesting ways to write, interesting language being used here to signify so many different ways. Excuse me if I sound a little nerdy right now, but this is very, very interesting. So we see Rachel's dead. So Rachel's dead. She's gone. She is gone from the earth. Jacob is left without his beloved wife, Rachel. She's gone forever. And she was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is now later called Bethlehem. And very interesting right there. We're on the way to Bethlehem. It's funny. On the way to Bethlehem is when Rachel died. On the way to Bethlehem, the guy whose God's own kingdom was named after, his beloved wife died, going to the same place where God's own son was in the womb. It was in Mary's womb, about to be born. It's very amazing. Jesus was in Mary's womb, about to be born, going to Bethlehem, while the founder of it, who God used to found Israel, his wife died on the way to the same place. That was a very, very little interesting connection there. So it says Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. He's remembering his wife Rachel. The tomb is being redone. It's set up. She's remembering Rachel, making sure she has a proper burial. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. It's still there. According to Scripture, it's there to this day. That's in verse 20. So here comes the dead thing. It's being remembered. It's given a proper burial. It's dead. It's gone. It has no more meaning almost. It has no more life in it. No more super meaningful significance. It's just dead. It's just gone. It's something to remember briefly and then move on from. This is where we really get to our point. It says in 21, Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the power of Eden. Now, you may be thinking, why did I tell that story? What was the point? It's like, look, all right, dude's wife died. He loved his wife. His beloved wife died. He buried her, and then he moved on. And I want you to pay attention to some very, very special wording within here. It says in verse 20, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. In 21, it says Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. Jacob was the guy who wrestled with God. So Jacob wrestled with God, and in the process of wrestling God, God renamed him Israel, which means wrestled with God. So this identity of Israel versus Jacob. So Jacob, this guy, if you don't know who Jacob is, I'd encourage you to read about him. I'd encourage you to listen to some sermons about him. He's a very well taught figure in the Bible. He's the grandson of Abraham, who God first called to start his kingdom. It's who God first called into the promised land. So Jacob's this grandson of Abraham. His dad is Isaac. His brother's Esau. There's a famous story about Jacob and Esau, about how because Jacob was the youngest, they were twins, but Jacob came out grabbing Esau's heel, and so he was therefore born second, and he doesn't get the birthright. Back in that culture, if you're the firstborn son, you got dad's birthright. Esau, born first. Jacob came half a second after him, stillborn second. So Jacob doesn't have this inheritance. He wants his inheritance. He makes a scheme with his mom, and he and his mom conspire against Isaac, who is nearly blind. They put sheepskin or fur over his arms, and they tricked Isaac into giving Jacob the birthright instead of Esau. So now Jacob just tricked Esau out of his birthright. It's where this term Jacob, that name, it starts to mean deceiver, the one who deceives, right? Because Jacob deceived his dad and stole his brother Esau's birthright. So the story for another time. This is who Jacob is. Throughout his entire life, Jacob has kind of schemed. He's done things to advance himself. He's a deceitful person, and he has done these different things, including going and wrestling with God himself. He is wrestling with God. Like, he's not being obedient to God in this moment. He's not saying, God, your will be done over mine. Like, right? He's not saying, God, I want your will to be done before my will is being done. He's literally fighting God. He's wrestling with God. But now what we see with Israel, his new name, after he wrestled with God, he named Israel. And what we see with Israel and who Israel is this new person. When you changed your name in that culture, it was like an identity of its own. It was its own identity, just like we talked about a couple weeks ago. That was a great episode. If you haven't listened to it, I very much encourage you to listen to it. So we're talking about identity. Jacob, his new identity has now become Israel. So he's gone from this person of deception. He's gone from this person of going behind your back, of not being trustworthy. And now, yes, Israel means to wrestle with God or wrestles with God. But Israel is this new identity of my name is to be used to reference God's people. God's people are the Israelites. And the 12 tribes of Israel are named after his sons, his 12 sons. That's what becomes the tribes of Israel. So what we see now with Jacob or Israel, what we see with Israel is this is the good side of Israel. This is the side that imagine Jacob would be your sinful side, everything that you're ashamed of, everything that you've done wrong, everything that you want to hide. But Israel's that part of you where you're like, man, I want people to see this. This goes on your Instagram post. This goes on your Insta stories. This goes on your TikTok and your Snapchat. You want people to know about this. You go around, you talk about this. Maybe you did a service project. Maybe you help somebody out with something. Whatever the case, maybe you got this big promotion at work. Whatever the case, Israel is that part that you want everybody to see, that you want everybody to know. It's the famous part of you. It's that good part of you. It's that part of you that's done some really good stuff. But Jacob's the bad part. And so what we see with this transition, it's almost a baptism of its own. It's almost a rebirth of its own. Jacob sets up that pillar over the tomb. Jacob buries her. Jacob remembers her. Jacob puts everything over her tomb and sets everything up. But Israel journeyed on. Israel is the one who moved on. Israel is the one who continued going. Israel is the one who kept going and kept doing great things and kept staying on the faith and staying on that journey. And what I see with this story of Jacob to Israel, and this evolution between verse 20 and 21, where references of Jacob and then to Israel. What I see here is Jacob's dead too. Jacob, it's still referring to him as Jacob. Jacob has been buried with Rachel. Jacob has been buried with the love of his life, with the one he loved, with the one that he had Joseph and Benjamin with, his two most beloved sons. He died with her. He buried himself with her. He's gone too. Because what we see in 21, Israel journeyed on. Israel kept going. Israel continued his journey to Bethlehem. Israel is how the story continues. In verse 22, it still refers him to Israel. It says Israel. Like this, he continues to be Israel moving forward, even past that verse, even past this passage. Israel is now moving on. This father of this kingdom of God, he is the father of it. He's moving on. This good part of us is now moving on, and that dead part is staying with Rachel. It's staying with that whole history. So guys, and whatever we're here to do, we talked about identity back on January 6th. We talked about New Year's resolutions, January 13th, with my good friend Kyle Plant. We enjoyed that one if you guys want to check it out. We talked about New Year's resolutions, why people fail, why it's a flawed system in the first place. And so, guys, when we're thinking of moving on, we're thinking of, hey, when Israel moved on, it means he had to leave something behind. Not just himself, not just Jacob. He had to leave his beloved wife behind. He had to leave Rachel behind. Rachel was left behind. She was dead. And that is how Israel was able to move on. Israel moved on. That new part of him kept growing, kept moving on, kept going, because he left stuff in his past. Because he left that in the grave. He left that in the tomb. And he moved on. So my question to you guys is, what happened last year? What stuff were you dealing with? What were you struggling with? What was your burdens? What chained your ankles? What was your ball and chain that drug you down and stopped you from doing the things that you either wanted to do or the things that you could have done past the things that you just wanted to do? What held you down? And how can you move on past that? I'm not saying to change your name. You don't need to do that. You don't need to change your name. But what I'm saying is, what do we leave behind? What do we leave dead? What do we leave in the tomb to now continue moving on in that good part of us? How do we continue to move on in the good? How do we continue to move on and do everything that we're supposed to do everything that we set out to do everything that we are meant to do, and accomplish the plan that God has for our lives? How do we do that? And if we can figure that out, if we can figure out what we have to leave behind to become that new version of us, to become that good version of us, to become that version of us that follows God's plan, that we fulfill God's plan and what he has for our lives, if we do that, ladies and gentlemen, we will have success. We will have fulfillment beyond anything me and you have ever imagined. So my challenge to you guys this week, as we continue to find ways to live for his glory, is, what do you need to leave in 2024? What do you need to leave in your past? What identity do you need to leave behind? What beloved things that you need to leave behind so that you can grow and move forward and become everything that God wanted you to be, everything that you are meant to be? How can you leave this stuff behind to move forward with God's plan for your life and uncover that new identity of who God wants you to be? Thank you for listening to another episode of the Living for His Glory podcast. I hope you gained some terrific insights and knowledge about God's character and how we can live for His glory. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so that you can get every new episode as we continue to make deep dives as to how to live for His glory. Thank you, and I hope you have an amazing day.